The dealings of God with his people should be often repeated. How frequently were the waymarks set up by the Lord in his dealings with ancient Israel? Lest they should forget the history of the past, he commanded Moses to frame these events into song, that parents might teach them to their children. They were to gather up memorials and to lay them up in sight. Special pains were taken to preserve them, that when the children should inquire concerning these things, the whole story might be repeated. Thus, the providential dealings and the marked goodness and mercy of God in his care and deliverance of his people were kept in mind. Reading from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 6, pages 364 and 365. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Sabbath School study. We are almost in the end of this quarter, and we are going to study Israel in Egypt. And before we could go into the study, let us all bow down for a prayer. Our most gracious and loving Father in heaven, we humbly and earnestly ask for your Holy Spirit's presence and guidance as we begin this study, Lord. We pray that we will be able to understand what you are to tell us, Father. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So we are almost coming to the end of this quarter, and such a lovely study on the book of Genesis. It's not just a storybook, but it contains all the practical situations which helps in our life so that we can see and we can learn.
So this week we are in the very end of Genesis. We are starting from the journey of Jacob. Jacob is now going into Egypt, and the lesson ends with the death of Joseph, the end of the book of Genesis. So we are going to not discuss in detail, but we are going to do something different this week. We are going to take three people and look at this story from their perspective. So the first person would be Jacob. How all these events affected Jacob and what would have possibly gone on in his mind even as these things were transpiring. The second person would be Joseph, who was directly the hero sort of in the story. And the last person would be the one who recorded these events down, the story, the perspective of Moses. What was going on in Moses' mind when he was writing down all these things? So let's divide it into several parts for convenience. The first part would be Jacob going down to Egypt. So Jacob now hears that Joseph is alive. He has shown the proofs and he's starting to go, and that's where the lesson begins. So what do you think, Ceci? What would have been, what was going on in Jacob's mind as he was preparing and as he was traveling towards Egypt?
As it is, Jacob is there waiting for the arrival of his sons, especially Benjamin. He didn't know whether Benjamin is going to come back, but he got the news that Benjamin is fine. He got the news that Joseph was alive, which was the most important and which made him so happy, and he was so filled with joy.
Shocking message for him.
Yeah, shocking, and at the same time, a surprise and a happy news. And also the fact that his family is going to be provided for, because Jacob had to carry on the promise. God had promised to Abraham that he will make of him a great nation. And now Jacob, when he saw that there was famine, and when he saw how his sons were, he was thinking Joseph died, Simeon is not there, and now he was not even sure whether Benjamin is going to come back or no, and for how many days they're going to survive. Don't know for how long the famine is going to last. And I'm just telling, he would have also been worried about how the people are going to multiply and how they'll become a nation, because seeing these circumstances, he would have thought how the promise is going to be fulfilled. But now he's got assurance for everything. And hence, before making the trip to Egypt, he's very happy. He could have just gone at one point when God said everything is available, and even Joseph knew that everything was available. But still, we see that Jacob was praying to God. He wanted to have that assurance whether God is going to be with him. See, God was with him throughout. The assurance he wanted was whether God will bring them back to Canaan, the promised land, and or is he going to settle in Egypt? And because by settling in Egypt, the promise is not going to be fulfilled. So, and God assured him that Egypt is a right place for them to multiply, to grow into a nation, and they will surely come back one day and inherit the promised land. And as he's traveling, he just wanted to see Joseph. That was his. He wanted to see Joseph. He wanted to see Joseph's sons, and even though he knew that Joseph was the ruler, he just wanted to see his son. That was all he was waiting for. Not just that. Notice how he would have also been happy, because when Jacob's brothers had to tell that Joseph is alive, they had to also confess their sins. And when they did that, even that, Joseph would have been happy. His journey would have been, I think, the most happiest journey of all the journeys that he would have made. Because each time he journeyed, we saw the first time he had to flee from his brother, second time he had to flee from his father-in-law, third time he had to flee from Shechem. And every journey, there was so much of tension. But this one, he's so happy. He's going to see his long lost son, and he saw how his sons confessed the truth, and he could see that they were changed and they were repented. So I think this was the last journey that he made in his life, and it was the most happiest and peaceful journey for him. And uh, we see that he is spending 17 years in Egypt, and the 17 years was the most happiest time in his life, and it was very peaceful for him.
We will come to that later.
Okay.
But a certain point I think would have been running in his mind was the prophecy that God gave to Abraham. God said that your progeny or your descendants will be enslaved in a strange land, and they will serve the strangers for 400 years. And Jacob has been counting, and now God is telling him to go to Egypt, and he knows Egypt is a mighty nation, and it is entirely capable of enslaving them. And that prophecy would definitely have been running in his mind, even though the Bible doesn't talk about it so explicitly. Everything that happened to Abraham and Isaac, Jacob knew by heart, and Jacob knew that God had foretold him regarding what's going to happen. And so Jacob would have thought about all these things, and definitely he would have been a little anxious. And more than that, he would have been anxious about how his son is going to react, how he will see his son, or whether is it even true that Joseph is alive. So all these doubts would have been in his mind, and it would have been a bittersweet journey. As Sissy said, it definitely was one of the happiest journeys in his life. A journey with a reconciled family, a family where all the members have dedicated themselves to God, have determined to follow the ways of God, and the Spirit of God is moving so heavily, and they had a very subdued and quiet spirit, unlike the journey that Jacob had taken before. So that is from Jacob's perspective. From Joseph's point of view, Joseph would have been anxiously waiting. See, the famine was ripe in the land, and Joseph is serving the Egyptians on one side. So while his work was very hectic and very busy, on the other hand, his anxiety and his joy, anticipation in the fact that he's going to see his father would have been at the peak. And Joseph would have been longing and waiting to see his dad, whom he had not seen for the past more than 20 years, for that matter. Nearly 30 years he has not seen us. He has not seen his 20, 25 years, he has not seen his father, and so he's very anxious on one side. And then he's thinking about his wife. Father doesn't know he's married. Father doesn't know that he has children. And so how will his father react to the fact that he's married an Egyptian? And how will his children, who has never seen their grandfather, how will they react to his father? All these thoughts would have been going on in Joseph's mind. And Moses' perspective is something that is very situational. I mean, that is very significant at this point of time. You see, Moses wrote this book, Genesis, when he was with his father-in-law Jethro in the wilderness. The two books of Moses, the book of Job, which is credited to him, and Genesis, both of these being the very first books of the Bible, written by Moses when he was in the wilderness. The book of Job probably preceding the book of Genesis. And so just imagine this story from Moses' perspective as he's writing down. He has just written a few chapters ago the promise of God to Abraham that the nation would multiply, and that Moses has written that at the end of 400 years that God will bring them out of land of Egypt, out of land of bondage. And now he's writing that Jacob is making that fateful journey, that journey which determined the fate of the children of Israel. Right now, when Moses was writing this in a scroll, the children of Israel were groaning and suffering heavily under bondage. So even as he's writing that Jacob was making the journey, he thought, oh Lord, when will this suffering end? It is because Jacob made that fateful journey that we are all stuck here. Definitely, maybe Moses was thinking that. And Moses was, he recalls the words of Joseph, he recalls the words of Jacob, he recalls everything that happens after that, and he's like, what's happening, God? When will you save these people? These people are suffering so much. Moses has fled the slavery and he's now living in peace with his father-in-law taking care of sheep. But the children of Israel were under heavy bondage. They were suffering day and night. And so Moses would have been in great confusion, maybe perhaps anxiety, or maybe even anticipation, even because he's writing about 400 years and about the 400-year prophecy. And in the book of Exodus, we find him writing that on the very day the 400 years got over, the children of Israel, the armies of God, they moved out of the land of Egypt. Maybe he's anticipating what's going to happen at the end of 400 years. 400 years are coming to an end. What's going to happen? And so all these anxieties, and like Joseph and Jacob are quite happy in this part of story, Moses would have been quite perplexed. What's going to happen? The children of Israel are still in bondage. Time is going to end. The time has come, but there is no sign of deliverance. Had Jacob just chosen to remain in Israel or in Canaan, we would not have come into this bondage. Maybe that was going on in his mind. And so even as the story progresses, we can see sections of how each of these people are thinking or what they're thinking. So God gave Jacob an assurance. And I think it is that assurance that God gave to Abraham, that specific promise that God gives to Jacob, even as Jacob is coming into Egypt. I think that would have strengthened Moses, that would have strengthened the children of Israel very much during the time of affliction, even as they knew that the time of deliverance, the promised deliverance, is quite nigh. And so Jacob comes, he's quite old at this point of time. He tells Pharaoh that he is 130 years, I believe, 130 years old. And being 130 years old and making a journey from Canaan to Egypt would have been quite harrowing or troublesome. And yet, the anticipation of seeing a son, in the anticipation, Jacob is making the journey, and he is finally reaching Egypt. So the next event in the story is Joseph taking his brethren and presenting them to Pharaoh. What would have been going on in Pharaoh's mind, and what would have been going on in the mind of Joseph?
Pharaoh wanted, he was seeking some way to express his gratitude towards Joseph, because for whatever Joseph did, 7 years, he had to work 14 years, he had to make sure for the first 7 years that he'll have enough of grain, and the next 7 years not just for his country, but also the surrounding the other countries. And because of which Egypt also could trade. We see when they came, the other countries, when the people came to buy grain, they were also trading other things. Uh, so for Pharaoh, seeing from that point of view, he felt he owed Joseph something. So he would have been ready to also raise Joseph's brothers to the position which Joseph was. Not exactly to the position which Joseph was, but at least a higher position in the palace, in the palace court. But in Joseph's,
What favor did Joseph actually do to Pharaoh? That Pharaoh was so grateful. You see, part of it is that Joseph had saved adequate amount of food to meet the crisis. That is one. That I would have been the most important fact, that there was enough food in Egypt to sustain all the Egyptians and more and extra to even provide for anyone who wanted to buy from Egypt. The second thing is that Joseph started selling corn for money initially, and definitely Joseph would not have inflated the price of corn. See, he's the only one who's having corn right now, and so he could have sold it any amount of price. But being a man of God and someone who fears God, Joseph would have sold at the right price. Even then, because of the intensity of the famine and due to the fact that nothing was growing outside, the Egyptians, they did not, all the money that they had in their banks or in their homes or whatever, in whatever form they had, maybe in gold, silver, everything got over. They're given it all at a fair price. Let's just keep that in mind, at a fair price to buy food. And even after buying all of that, spending all of that money, they still didn't have enough food. The famine didn't pass or didn't get over by the time they had spent all the money. And now the Egyptians are at a big dilemma what to do. There is no money, there is food available, but the cost is fair, but they don't have money. And so they are coming and asking Joseph what to do. Joseph purchased all the cattle, all the land, and even the Egyptians themselves as slaves. You see, before that, Pharaoh was a rich man, but now Pharaoh entirely owns Egypt, everything in Egypt, all the gold of Egypt, all the silver of Egypt, all the land of Egypt, all the people of Egypt, all of them are owned by Pharaoh, and it was because of the wise management of Joseph. And so Joseph made Pharaoh extremely rich and powerful. And so because of that, Pharaoh is Pharaoh wants to show gratitude, but he doesn't know what, because Joseph is not moved by money, he's not moved by wealth, he's not moved by women. He's married only one lady, though even though I'm sure Pharaoh would have offered him a lot more. But he is satisfied with just one lady, he's just satisfied with his meals, he's just satisfied with the salary he's getting. He's not at all worried about money, he's not at all worried about wealth, power, nothing is moving him. So Pharaoh is like, what can I do to make him happy? And because he knows that the moment Joseph steps down, his prosperity would not keep growing. It would have come to an end at that point. And so Pharaoh was very anxious to show goodwill to Joseph, and yet he did not know how to do it. The only thing he could do was find him a wife, and Joseph married the girl, and that's it, nothing more. And so Pharaoh is at a dilemma, and when he got an opportunity, Pharaoh wants to do everything in his power to make sure that Joseph is satisfied. And that's why I think Pharaoh was sort of anxious to somehow please Joseph so much that Joseph will stay in the place and not leave. Now that his family has come back, he's found his family. So Pharaoh goes a second mile. Yeah.
Any position for his brothers.
Yeah, I think that is one of the reasons that Joseph waited for 7 years. He didn't send messages to his father or his brethren and somehow intimate them and try to bring them here, because his value multiplied in the eyes of Pharaoh when it was the famine, not when the food was plenty. See, Joseph is building a lot of granaries, he's storing a lot of grain, but all of that did not matter so much to Pharaoh because all of those are expenses. He's building a lot of stuff. That means money is being spent from Pharaoh's coffers. But when the famine came, the coffers got overfilled. Then he knew the wisdom, the power of Joseph, the the way his management was. And definitely even during those 7 years, he's seeing how Joseph was impartial, how he was benevolent, and how he was wise in following, in strictly being impartial, and how wisely he was governing. So all of this contributed a lot to make Pharaoh anxious to please Joseph and his family.
Okay. So, but here we see Joseph telling his brothers to be honest and tell that the occupation of the brothers were shepherds, because shepherd was an abomination to the Egyptians. If they wouldn't have said so, then they would have had a nice position in the palace. One thing is, he didn't want them to lie because they were shepherds. Another reason is, he knew if they were put in such positions, what temptations they'll be exposed to, because even he was exposed to the same temptations. And in order to prevent that from happening, he tells them to be true to the position and whatever occupation they're telling. And this was also God's will, because we see them in Canaan. God had promised Canaan, and time and again, from the time of Abraham, whenever there's something in Canaan, they had to come to Egypt and then go back again. Come to Egypt and then go back again. And even now, the same thing, but this time they're going to stay for a longer period. And Egypt served as a good place for the Israel, now, which is a family of Israel, to develop into a nation, because they had good environment. They had lots of water, the greenery in the land of Goshen, and enough of crops to feed the entire family and cattle. And the very fact that they were shepherds, they were put away from the Egyptians, and they were away from all the idolatry. They were not involved in any pagan practices. So
they could have easily excused themselves
Yeah.
from participating with the Egyptians, celebrating with the Egyptians, and so on and so forth. And so they could have preserved the purity of their worship.
And also, it says they could have left Egypt whenever they wanted by doing so. If they would have been under the position which the Pharaoh would have given, then they would not have been able to leave
At
Egypt
freedom.
at freedom. This was also another reason. We see God's leading, how well the leading is, and they are in Egypt. Jacob now, we see he underwent so much in his life, and every time he saw his sons commit a sin and his family went into a problem, the only thing that came to his mind was the deception. He deceived Esau, and time and again this was a cycle. He had to just go through with it. It was like literally living with it. He lost his beloved wife, and then he lost his beloved son, and it was so difficult. But we see he died at peace. And the words of inspiration records the reasons as to why and what gave him that peace. One thing was, he saw that his family, his sons especially, they repented truly. They confessed their guilt and they truly repented. And the second thing was that he knew that this place will serve the purpose to fulfill God's will. That is Israel, which is a family developing into a nation. And that they will surely go back to the land of Canaan. If we now, this present day, if we need to live in peace, the true peace which Jesus has promised, which he doesn't give us, the world gives, even we need to truly repent. We need to put ourselves and do all that we can to build God's church, his remnant church. And we need to focus on going back to heaven. Are we sure whether we will enter the heavenly Canaan? Jacob was sure that they're going to go back to Canaan, that one day his family will go back there, his generations and the people who will be the generations that follow after as a nation, they'll be going back. He was sure of this, and which is why he died in peace. Similarly, this should be our only burden, and the rest will fall in place. We need to truly repent. We need to do all that we can to build our church, and we need to focus on the heavenly Canaan. Only if we are sure, assured of a place, and assured that we will go back to the heaven, only then we have true peace.
So just imagine Moses writing this. So he's writing about Pharaoh. He is anxious to please Joseph. He's writing about how Joseph increased the wealth of Egypt, how Joseph bought the entire land of Egypt, not just the land of Egypt. See, even Joseph is even selling to the Canaanites. So even from Canaan and from maybe Ethiopia, we don't know, all around Egypt, from different countries, people are coming to buy grain, and they're paying huge amounts of money to get the grain, and all that money is flowing into Pharaoh's coffers. And as Moses is writing about this, I'm sure he would have been so angry at the ingratitude of the Pharaohs. See, Joseph had died maybe 120 or 130 years ago. That's it. Not even 150 years have passed. So in those days, see, Joseph lives 110 years. So 150 is just the lifespan of 2 generations. And what had happened in grandfather's time, this present Pharaoh is refusing to recognize. It's not that like so many years have passed that people forgot about Joseph, that Pharaoh forgot about Joseph, and he didn't know who Joseph was. That was not the case. Even though Moses writes that there arose another Pharaoh who did not know about Joseph, it is not because the Pharaoh did not know about Joseph, but rather it was a slight. He did not want to recognize that it was a Hebrew, a slave who had brought all this wealth into his hand. And he refused to recognize the superiority of the God of Joseph. See, that is that is the end point of all the blessings that Egypt experienced. It was not because Joseph was extraordinarily wise that Egypt was saved. It was because of the God of Joseph. They could see that Joseph was true to his word, was true to his duty to the very pin. He did not even steal a penny from Egypt, even though he had all the authority to take as much money as he wants. Because Pharaoh said, "You are second to me in position." He gave away the ring. With the ring, Joseph could have rebelled for that matter and overtaken Pharaoh. And I'm sure most of the people would have agreed with Joseph because he's the one who's providing bread, not Pharaoh. They've never seen Pharaoh, but Joseph is like moving with the people. He is providing food to them. And yet Joseph was so faithful and so loyal to the person, and his execution of duty is so faultless. And it is because of his genius or his God. People could recognize the superiority of the God of Israel. And this Pharaoh, he did not want to. Well, in the history, there are some people, if they are placing the time right, they are telling that there was a change in dynasty, and the king of the new dynasty, he refused to recognize the Joseph. But even if they had been a change in dynasty, that would not have been an adequate excuse to forget what Joseph did to increase the wealth of Egypt. See, the entire land of Egypt was blessed by the single person, and yet the Pharaoh forgot. So Moses would have been, righteous anger would have come in his mind. How can he do? Forgetting the favor is one thing, but putting the descendants through so much cruelty. See, they were commanded to throw their sons, the newborn children, into the river to be killed. And Pharaoh was doing everything in his part to make their lives miserable. And that is something so ungrateful, so uncalled for, that Moses would have been boiling in anger even as he was writing, and he would have been questioning, how can God not see? Did not God help Egypt in preserving the nation? Entire Egypt would have been destroyed had Joseph not saved enough grain. You see what's happening right now perhaps in Sri Lanka. Whenever there is a huge inflation, the price for food is so high, And most of the people, common people, they are not able to afford. What is the natural result is a revolution. People start rebelling against the government. Anarchy will come. They will destroy all the government property, and they will try to destroy the government, even though destroying the government is not going to change anything. But the anger of the people will naturally be directed towards the rulers, and the ones who ultimately suffer would be the ones who in authority. And that would have been the state of Egypt had Joseph not intervened and provided relief. And yet the king was so ungrateful that he is cruelly dealing with Israelites. So Moses would have been so troubled. He would have been questioning God. You preserved the nation. You saved the nation from destruction. Egypt would have been destroyed had it not been for your intervention. And yet they are persecuting your people, and you're keeping so quiet, even though you promised that you'll bring them out. What's happening, Lord? Moses would have been questioning definitely in his mind why God is allowing all these things. And is there a relief? Will there ever come a day when we will get rid of the part of Egypt? See, when Joseph made the covenant with the Pharaoh, it was a covenant of equals, as in the Israelites were permitted to leave the land whenever they pleased. That was a sort of covenant that they made. They said they will dwell in the land of Goshen until the famine is over or until a certain favorable time, and then they will move out. They are not going to plunder Egypt. They are not going to do any harm to the Egyptians. They'll just live there, and then they'll move out when the time is right. And now the condition seems hopeless. Pharaoh has already enslaved all of them, and they are being put to work. Nobody will free slaves without, I mean, for no reason. Nobody would like to get rid of free labor. And so Moses is like, even though we made a covenant of freedom, we are being treated as slaves, and there seems to be no hope. He has not really see, even though he wrote about creation, he wrote about the God who could do amazing things. God has still not worked in such a grand scale as he is going to work now in the future, in the imminent future, as to like redeeming the people out of the land of Egypt. The 10 plagues that he sent showed Moses who God really was, even though Moses wrote about creation. He now understood that all creation is under God's control, and God still is the sovereign. So Moses was about to see who God is. And from God's perspective, God would have been patiently waiting and seeing how his children are reacting. He knew that the time of promise is about to come, and that children of Israel have to be delivered. He's still seeing how Moses is reacting, how the children of Israel, are they really praying for deliverance? Are they recognizing that the time of promise has come? And are they asking me to save them? Or I've been waiting for somebody to stand up and pray regarding the fulfillment of the prophecy. And so all these people are even though they are in different times, they're all standing and looking at the events that are happening. And so are we. And so we find that Jacob is blessing Pharaoh, even though Egypt treated his son so unfairly. For 10 years, his son was a slave. Egyptians never bothered to ask why he was sold as a slave. And for 2 years, he was being put in prison for no cause. And yet, this is the magnanimity of God. God is so merciful. The Bible keeps telling his mercy endureth forever. And his people, even if we are mistreated, even if they are hated for no reason, they still love back. And Jacob so beautifully demonstrated that when he blessed Pharaoh, even though he had all the reason to curse him for the unfairness that his son had undergone in the first years of his life in Egypt. And it also shows the superiority of Jacob over Pharaoh. Pharaoh recognized the wisdom of Joseph, and he knew that it should have come from his father. And he recognized, even though we don't know if he actually got changed, if he actually accepted God, he knew the superiority of the God of Israel over the gods of Egypt. None of the gods of Egypt forewarned or did anything to help in this current famine. It was the God of Israel who did all these things. And so Pharaoh recognizes the superiority of Jacob's God, and he allows Jacob to bless him. Bible says the lesser is blessed of the greater, talking about Abraham and Melchizedek. Bible clearly says Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. And going by the same rule, we find here Jacob blessing Pharaoh, signifying that Jacob was greater than Pharaoh. And so, we pass on. Jacob blessed Joseph's sons, and Jacob blessed his children, and he passed away. That is the next event. What would have been going on in Jacob's mind when he was blessing his children? You see, some children got blessings, others no blessings. Some people even got cursed.
We see Jacob didn't want to benefit the first. He always loved his son. Actually, after what would have happened to Joseph, he would never, out of his own will, want to give blessing to one and curse another. But when he was blessing his son, we see it noted from spirit of prophecy that the spirit of visitation was upon him. And whatever he blessed, it contained the character of that son, the blessing, and the prophecy. So it was not a curse, but rather what he said was the character of that person and what will happen to them in the future. It was somewhat similar.
It's a foreknowledge of God. God foresaw
Yes.
what happened. And,
yes. Yeah. So every blessing, this is what it contained. But we see one interesting thing: the birthright. It has two parts. One is the double portion of the entire birthright, which is one is that, and the other is the crowning portion of the birthright, and that is through the line which the Messiah will be born, and that was given to Judah, and the double portion was given to Joseph. So this was something like, Noah, he didn't curse Ham, yeah, but it was just a prophecy that he was telling. So even this, he just foretold what will be happening to each of the tribe.
Well, I'm also sure that none of his children, even though Reuben was not blessed, he was sort of cursed. And Simeon and Levi definitely were cursed. They said, God will scatter you in Israel. And yet, none of them were dissatisfied with what their father said. They knew that it was a prophecy, and they had learned of the meekness and lowliness of Christ. And so they accepted with gratitude the words of their father, and they repeated these words to their children. How wonderful it will be to live in a family like that. A family where the brethren are united, where it doesn't matter one person is getting more than the other, because they all love each other. And for this to be true, for them to not be angry or for them not to be envious when somebody is being blessed and the other person is getting cursed, it would mean that they all loved each other and they all wanted the best for one another, not for themselves. Had Reuben really wanted to be blessed, to be the first, because he's the firstborn and he deserves a birthright, and that the Christ should come through his line and that he should get double portion, he would not have been happy to hear his father blessing Judah and Joseph, and yet he was happy, showing he wanted the very best of blessings for his brethren. We should have that trait. We should not decide the best of blessings for ourselves, but we should decide that God would bless everybody and those around us, and perhaps that God would even bless them more than he blesses us. We should be happy and we should be rejoicing when we see others who are being blessed. We should not be envious, and that will be true when we have the love of Christ in our hearts. Coming to Moses, for Moses, this would have been again a point of a lot of questions. See, Jacob is telling that Israel will triumph. Regarding the tribes of Israel, he's telling Benjamin is like a ravenous wolf. He will go and slaughter his prey. And he's telling Judah is like a lion. Who can stand for a lion? Nobody can. I mean, even the strongest of bravest of warriors, when they hear the roar of a lion, their heart will melt. And that's why to kill a lion is something very significant, because just the roar of the lion will cause us to shiver, because we are so weak-hearted, unlike a lion, is so strong-hearted. And so Jacob says that Judah is like a lion, that Benjamin is like a wolf, that I think Gad is like a troop, and somebody, I mean, he's also comparing some of his children to a donkey, to a serpent, to a horse, and so on and so forth. And all of these signify different strengths, that they will triumph and they will be blessed, and so on and so forth. But what Moses is seeing is that all the 12 tribes, regardless of which tribe we are from, they are being oppressed, and none of the characters that that Jacob blessed them with is actually happening. They are not they are not victorious. They are not brave. They are cowards. They are enslaved. They are even killing their own children at the command of the king. And so Moses would have been very perplexed. Is it going to happen at all, or has God actually left us? Such thoughts would have been running in his mind, and especially regarding the words of Joseph. Joseph said, "When God takes you out of Egypt, remember, you will carry my bones with me." It was not, lesson says it was not a command, but an assertion that when this happens, I'm sure you would also take my bones. That's what Joseph was trying to convey. And so that showed, you see, Joseph telling that is a very significant thing. Had one of his brethren told that, it would not have been it would not have been a thing for wonder. I mean, thing of wonder, because none of them really held any part except for Joseph. They were all just shepherds living in Goshen, having enough food for themselves and for their cattle and for their families. But Joseph was not like that. Joseph was the ruler of Egypt. He had so much power, so much influence, so much authority under him, and yet, brethren, our dear friends, his heart was not bound up with Egypt. He says, "You must carry me away from this place. This is not my home. I was sold here." He told the butler, "I was sold here by mistake. I was sold here. I was stolen from my land and I was brought here." And that thought never left his heart, even though he became so powerful, so wealthy, so honored in Egypt. He, in his heart, he was always a stranger in a strange land. He was stolen away from Canaan, from the promised land. And in his heart, the depths of his heart, he wanted to go back there. Even if he was sure that Pharaoh would not allow him to be buried in Canaan, because he is the prime minister, one of the highest authorities in Egypt, and he had to be given all honors and buried in the land of Egypt. That that would have been mandatory at least at that point of time. And yet Joseph, all of this didn't matter. He wanted his bones to rest in the plain old Canaan. See, Canaan at this point was not as developed as Egypt. Canaan was more like little tribes gathering together and just being there. Egypt was a mighty nation. Egypt was well organized, well built, well administered, unlike the land of Canaan, which a bunch of different people, 7 to 10 different tribes are like roaming all around. As God says, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Canaanites, and so on and so forth. And they're all small tribes. They're not well established kingdoms. And Joseph is telling, from this land of culture, take me back to that barbarous wilderness and bury me there. For him, that was that was paramount. In his heart, he always recognized the fact that he is a citizen of the land of Canaan, of the promised land, and that he had been stolen out of the place and has been brought here. He wanted the bones to not be stolen out of Egypt, but to be taken back boldly and then buried in the land of Canaan. And that promise of Moses would have really talked so much, because that is the last thing that Moses writes in the book of Genesis. He closes the book with that thought that the bones of Joseph should be taken. In fact, it is Moses who takes the bones of Joseph, because he's the one who wrote it down. This would have spoken the most to him, that Joseph was very sure that day will come when the Israelites will go out of Egypt. Even though Moses had no clue at all, none at all, how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, or if it will happen at all, Moses records, even if I'm not going to take Joseph's bones, whoever is really going to read this, at least the future generations of Israel who's going to get out of this place, they would somehow read this and they would somehow take the bones of Joseph back to the promised land. And so when he finished the book of Genesis, the mind of Moses would have been in perplexity, even though he has gotten away from his brethren and perhaps 40 years he's away. See, when you live in a place 40 years, you tend to forget what happened 40 years back. You are now settled with your wife, you have your own children, you have your own cattle to take care, and a lot of local problems would have happened, and Moses would have been the man of authority there trying to solve all these problems, because you see Jethro had 7 daughters, and so the other 6 would have had to get married, and I mean, yeah, so many different things going on in his father-in-law's place, that he would have had ample opportunities to forget about Israel and the sufferings that they were undergoing there. And yet, even as he is writing these words, the fact that his children, his nation are suffering, his people are suffering there, his parents, his sister who cared for him when he was a baby, his brother, we don't know what Aaron did, but Aaron would have definitely done a lot of things to ensure that Moses was safe. And and his people for whom he loved so much, who were the inheritors of promise, they were in the land of slavery. All the thoughts which he had probably buried in his mind would have come back and spoken to him, and perhaps he was emburdened, or he was burdened by all these thoughts when he suddenly saw the bush that was burning there. Even as Moses was thinking about all these things, what happened? When will the promise happen? When will we take the bones of Joseph? He's seeing that there was a bush that was burning there, and he was so enraptured by it that, forgetting all his sheep, all his worries, he's getting near to see what is this that I'm seeing. He has written about fire coming from heaven and burning the offering of Abraham, and yet he has never seen something like this. He has never seen, actually himself, never seen fire coming down from heaven. And so when he saw the bush burning, I'm sure, see, this is something that we need to keep in mind. God doesn't reveal himself at random times to us. For him to reveal himself to us, our minds should have been centered on him. You see, that night, the night that Christ was born, the reason why the shepherds only had a revelation of the angels was that at that particular night, only the shepherds were talking about Messiah. Only the shepherds were worried about when Messiah will come, when will the promised deliverer come. Just like how Moses, I'm sure, would have been worried for when will we take the bones of Joseph up and out of this land into the land of Canaan. When will my people be delivered? That was the pressing thing that was going on in the mind of Moses, even as he was rolling up the scroll, when he sees that the bush was burning there. See, God communicates to us when we are burdened with the fact that God's people are suffering, by the fact that Christ has not yet come, that is, people, just imagine, the world is suffering, God's people are suffering, the animals are suffering, the environment is suffering, and yet we, God's people who know the gospel, are we really burdened about all these things? Are we sitting and asking, when will Christ come? Do we have the burden of Moses? Do we have the burden of the shepherds? I'm sure when we have that, God will reveal himself to us, and that we will get to know him as we have never known him before. And he is waiting eagerly to see if we would have that desire. See, that Jesus kept on warning, awake, do not sleep, be alert. You don't know what time I'm going to come. Be ready for it. And so, as Elijah says, when he manifests his character, he will come and pick us up, and he will put an end to all this suffering. Friends, so let us take it upon ourselves to read through. See, Moses was so inspired. That holy anger, that burden for his people came because he looked back at the promises of God, and he saw his people suffering. He empathized with them, and that brought about that righteous anger. And it is the same with us. God has given all these prophecies so that we will understand that time of deliverance is near. And when we actually understand that we are suffering, that the world itself is suffering, that as a church, as people, we are being enslaved by the enemy and his people, it is then that we will get that righteous anger. And then it will be then that burden will come upon us for our salvation, for the salvation of our children, for the salvation of our church, our friends, our relatives, maybe our co-workers, our neighbors. Even as we see people suffering, we will get that anger and we will plead with God for there to be an end. And that is what will cause know more about him and will cause God to reveal himself to us. May God grant us his privilege and help us to have such a wonderful experience. Shall we close with a prayer? Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, so much for this time. Thank you for the wonderful lesson study, Lord, for the beautiful ending to the book of Genesis, for the promise that Joseph got from his brethren that they would carry his bones, that every time they saw his bones, they were reminded that this is not their home, that Egypt is not their home, and that they have a nation that God has promised them, a place where God has promised that they would dwell there and they would multiply there. Father, help us, Lord, to even as we see all the cruelty, all the suffering, or all the unrighteousness that's happening around, that we also would be burdened for our own lives. Even as we see us slipping, Lord, going away from you, even as we see your people suffering in this world, that we would have the same righteous anger of Moses, and Lord, that we would long for deliverance from this cursed world, that we would long to set the world free, to set the animals free, to set even for the matter, even the wicked people free from their own wickedness, so that the world at last would be. Help us, Lord, to have it, God, and pray for the soon coming of our King. And Lord, we love you for the fact that you've done so much for us, and that you are so eager to reveal yourself to us. If you will meditate on day and night, you do so from day. Help us, Lord, to love you and to desire a revelation of yourself, to understand you more, and to reveal and to submit ourselves so that your character will be revealed in our lives. We pray that you would bless the Sabbath, that we would all have a wonderful Sabbath. In the name of Jesus, we pray.
Thank you, friends, for joining us.